One decision inside a war hospital would remain hidden for decades, not because no one witnessed it, but because everyone who did had a reason to stay silent. A wounded prisoner was placed on an operating table where no one believed he belonged, and before anyone reached for a single medical instrument, someone quietly suggested letting time solve the problem instead. One young nurse heard those words, looked at the man everyone called the enemy, and realized that saving him might cost everything she had left. She wasn't choosing between two soldiers. She was choosing between the oath she had made and the fear that ruled everyone around her. What could make an ordinary nurse risk her future for someone she had never met? And why would the man she saved spend the rest of his life searching for her name? The answer began long before either of them understood what that single afternoon would mean. Winter settled heavily across central Germany during the final months of the war. The snow softened broken rooftops and empty streets, making destruction appear strangely peaceful from a distance. Inside a military hospital converted from an old Catholic school, the smell of antiseptic mixed with coal smoke drifting through cracked windows that no longer closed properly. Every hallway echoed with hurried footsteps, whispered instructions, and the constant uncertainty of another day. Anna Keller had worked there for nearly 3 years. At 27, she had learned to recognize exhaustion in the smallest movements. She noticed trembling hands before anyone admitted weakness. She noticed silent fear hiding behind polite smiles. Most of all, she had learned that uniforms rarely revealed the person wearing them. Her father had been a country physician who taught her one lesson before she ever touched a medical textbook. A patient is simply the person who needs you most. He never added conditions. He never mentioned flags, governments, or battlefields. Those words have followed her into every operating room since the day she became a nurse. That cold morning, an ambulance stopped outside the hospital entrance. 2 orderlies opened the rear doors without speaking. The man inside wore the faded flight jacket of an American airman. His face was pale from exposure, his breathing shallow but steady, and a pair of military police followed close behind, their expressions leaving little doubt about how everyone expected this story to end. Conversations slowed as the stretcher rolled through the corridor. Several nurses lowered their eyes. One doctor quietly shook his head before reading a single page of the medical chart. Anna watched from the end of the hallway, feeling something shift in the silence before anyone spoke a word. Dr. Ernst Vogel removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and stared at the chart for several long seconds without turning a page. The room remained quiet except for the ticking of an old wall clock and the soft crackling of the coal stove in the corner. Finally, he set the clipboard down on the metal table. "We have German soldiers waiting for surgery," he said in a tired voice. "This man is not our priority." No one challenged him. No one needed to. Months of shortages had made impossible choices feel almost routine. There were never enough blankets, never enough medicine, never enough hours before another ambulance appeared at the front entrance. One nurse lowered her eyes toward the floor. Another folded fresh bandages that might never be used. The silence itself sounded like agreement. Anna remained where she stood. Her gaze drifted from the chart to the unconscious pilot, whose breathing rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Snowflakes still clung to the shoulders of his jacket, melting slowly onto the canvas stretcher beneath him. He looked younger than she had expected, perhaps only a few years older than her youngest brother had been before he disappeared on the Eastern Front. There was nothing extraordinary about his face. Without the uniform, he could have been a schoolteacher waiting for a train or a farmer stopping for coffee before sunrise. War had wrapped ordinary people inside unfamiliar identities. Anna stepped closer until she could hear each strained breath. She rested 2 fingers lightly against his wrist. The pulse was weak, but steady enough to tell her something important. He still had time. She looked toward Dr. Vogel. "He is alive," she said quietly. The older physician met her eyes with visible exhaustion rather than anger. "That is precisely the problem," he answered. "If we begin this operation, someone else may not receive the care they need." Anna understood the arithmetic of war. Every bottle of penicillin, every clean sheet, Every hour inside the operating room carried a cost that could not be replaced. Yet another memory surfaced with startling clarity. She was 19 again, standing beside her father inside his small country clinic while a thunderstorm rattled the windows. A frightened boy had arrived after falling from a wagon. Before asking the family's name, before asking whether they could pay, her father had simply reached for his medical bag. Later that night, she had asked why he never hesitated. He smiled while washing his hands and answered, "The illness does not care who they are. Neither should the healer." Those words returned now with unexpected force. Anna drew a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and spoke so calmly that every person inside the room stopped moving. "Then let me take responsibility," she said. "If there is enough hope for one more heartbeat, there is enough reason to try." Dr. Vogel held Anna's gaze for another moment before giving a single, reluctant nod. It was not confidence. It was surrender to the possibility that compassion still deserved one final chance. The room came alive without another word. Cabinets opened. Sterile cloths were unfolded with practiced hands. A kettle hissed softly on the iron stove as fresh water warmed against the morning chill. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the falling snow, their familiar sound almost forgotten beneath the distant rumble of artillery miles away. Anna washed her hands with slow precision, repeating each movement exactly as she had been taught years before. Routine steadied the mind when emotion threatened to interfere. She tied the strings of her surgical gown, adjusted her gloves, and looked once more at the quiet face resting beneath the overhead lamp. His identification tag revealed only a name. Lieutenant James Carter, 29 years old, United States Army Air Forces. Nothing on the small metal tag explained the life that had existed before the uniform. Somewhere across the Atlantic, there might be parents waiting beside a kitchen window, perhaps a younger sister rereading old letters, perhaps an empty chair at a family dinner that no one was willing to move. Those thoughts lasted only a second before training reclaimed her attention. Every instruction inside the operating room was spoken softly, almost rhythmically. Instruments changed hands with familiar precision. Fresh bandages appeared before they were requested. The atmosphere remained calm, even as the old building groaned whenever the winter wind pushed against its weathered walls. Then, without warning, the electric lights flickered. Once, twice. The ceiling dimmed until shadows stretched across the walls. Every pair of eyes lifted instinctively. Power failures had become common during the final months of the war. One nurse reached for 2 oil lamps kept ready beneath a cabinet. Their warm, golden light replaced the cold glare of electricity, covering the room in a softer glow that seemed strangely peaceful despite the uncertainty outside. No one complained. No one hurried. They simply continued, and focused only on the steady rhythm of the patient before her. Time became impossible to measure. Minutes blended into hours. Snow gathered silently against the hospital windows, while daylight slowly faded into the pale gray of late afternoon. At last, Dr. Vogel stepped back and released a breath he seemed to have been holding all day. He looked toward the monitor of simple instruments they relied upon, and then toward Anna. The older physician did not smile. Men like him had forgotten how to celebrate small victories. Instead, he removed his gloves carefully and spoke with quiet honesty. "He still has a chance." Those 5 words filled the room with a silence unlike any that had come before. Anna lowered her shoulders for the first time since the operation had begun. She glanced at the unconscious pilot resting peacefully beneath clean blankets and realized that nothing about the world outside the hospital had changed. The war still waited beyond those walls. But inside that small room, humanity had quietly refused to surrender. James Carter drifted slowly toward consciousness as though he were surfacing through deep water. Sounds reached him before sight did. The faint scrape of a chair across a wooden floor. The quiet ticking of the same old clock. The distant ringing of church bells carried through frosted windows by the cold afternoon wind. None of it resembled the chaos he expected. He opened his eyes only halfway before closing them again, uncertain whether he was awake or trapped inside another dream. His last clear memory was a sky filled with smoke, then silence. Now there was only warmth. A wool blanket rested across his shoulders. Someone had tucked it carefully beneath his arms to keep the winter air away. He waited for shouted questions, harsh commands, or the cold certainty of interrogation. Instead, he heard a calm voice speaking softly to another nurse about fresh linens and warm broth for the evening patients. Nothing in the room suggested hatred. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed a woman standing beside the window, replacing a vase of wilted evergreen branches with fresh pine gathered from somewhere outside the hospital grounds. The sharp scent of pine drifted gently through the room, carrying with it the quiet reminder that winter still existed beyond those walls. Anna turned only after sensing movement. Their eyes met for the first time. Neither spoke. She stepped toward the bedside with measured confidence, checked the folded bandage with practiced hands, and placed 2 fingers lightly against his wrist. Her expression remained composed, almost unreadable, yet there was no trace of fear or resentment in her face. She simply observed what every nurse needed to know. His pulse had grown stronger. James watched her carefully. She wore the uniform of the nation he had spent months fighting, yet every movement contradicted the image he had carried across the Atlantic. She adjusted the blanket because it had slipped. She poured fresh water into a small enamel cup and placed it within reach before quietly stepping back. She expected nothing in return. His voice emerged rough and barely audible. Why? It was the only word he could manage. Anna looked toward him without surprise. For a brief moment, she seemed to consider the question before answering. Because you needed care. Nothing more. No speech about duty. No lecture about mercy. Only 5 simple words delivered with complete sincerity. James studied her face, searching for hidden meaning, but found only quiet certainty. The room settled once again into comfortable silence. Outside, snow continued falling across the hospital courtyard, covering footprints that had crossed the frozen ground only hours earlier. Inside, 2 people who had once existed only as enemies shared the same stillness without understanding that something far greater than survival had already begun. Neither of them spoke again that afternoon. They did not need to. Sometimes the absence of suspicion was the first language that strangers ever learned together. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that neither Anna nor James expected. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, turning the white walls of the hospital into shades of pale gold before fading into the soft gray afternoons of late winter. The war still existed beyond the building, but inside the recovery ward life was measured by smaller things. Fresh bandages, warm soup, clean blankets, the reassuring sound of footsteps returning at the beginning of every shift. James grew stronger one day at a time. He was allowed to sit beside the window for a few minutes each afternoon, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket while snow drifted across the courtyard outside. He noticed details he had ignored before the war. Sparrows gathering crumbs beneath a leafless tree. A nurse carefully straightening family photographs beside the bed of an elderly patient. Someone placing a small candle near the chapel door before sunrise. None of those moments fit the image he had carried of the people he had been taught to fear. Anna rarely stayed longer than necessary. She checked his pulse, changed his dressings, recorded careful notes, and continued to the next patient with the same calm attention she gave everyone else. There was never a trace of special treatment, and perhaps that was what surprised James the most. She did not see an American officer. She saw another person who happened to be recovering. One afternoon, she entered carrying a worn German language primer that had lost its cover years earlier. She placed it on the small table beside his bed without explanation. James looked at her with quiet curiosity. She opened the first page and pointed to a simple greeting. He repeated the unfamiliar words slowly, stumbling over the pronunciation until she offered the smallest hint of a smile. Then she pointed toward the cup in his hands. "Water," she said first in German, then in careful English. James repeated the German word. She nodded once. It became their routine. Every day brought another ordinary object. Window, chair, bread, snow. They built a conversation one word at a time, never discussing battles, governments, or victories. The language that mattered most was patience. As the week passed, James noticed a framed photograph resting on a shelf inside the nurse's station. It showed a younger Anna standing beside an older man wearing a physician's coat. When she caught him looking, she quietly lifted the frame and brushed away a layer of dust with her sleeve. "My father," she said softly. After a brief pause, she added, "He believed medicine should never wear a uniform." James lowered his eyes, letting those words settle into the silence between them. They remained with him long after Anna returned to her rounds, because for the first time since the war had begun, he realized that the greatest distance between two people was not measured in miles or nations, but in the stories they accepted before ever meeting one another. The fragile sense of peace inside the hospital lasted only a few more days before the outside world found its way back through the front doors. It arrived without warning, carried by the sharp echo of boots against the stone hallway. Conversations stopped almost instantly. Nurses who had been arranging supplies exchanged uneasy glances. Even Dr. Vogel paused in the middle of writing a patient's notes. Everyone recognized that sound. It belonged to men who did not come seeking treatment. 3 uniformed officers entered the reception hall, their winter coats still dusted with snow. Their expressions were disciplined and unreadable, but their purpose became clear the moment the senior officer unfolded a document bearing an official military seal. He requested access to every patient admitted during the previous week, especially foreign prisoners. The words spread through the building faster than any shouted alarm. Anna felt the change before anyone spoke directly to her. The corridors seemed narrower. The warm light from the oil lamps suddenly felt colder. She continued walking at her usual pace, carrying a tray of medicine through the recovery ward, refusing to let fear become visible on her face. When she reached James's room, she found him reading the small German-language book she had left on the bedside table. He looked up immediately, noticing the unusual silence beyond the door. "Something is different," he said carefully, his English voice stronger than it had been only days before. Anna glanced toward the hallway before closing the door halfway. "There are visitors," she answered quietly. She offered no further explanation, yet the tension in her eyes revealed more than her words ever could. James followed her gaze. He had spent enough time in uniform to recognize the look of someone measuring impossible choices. Downstairs, Dr. Vogel met the officers with professional courtesy, answering every question with calm precision. Patient records were requested. Admission logs were examined. One officer insisted on inspecting every occupied room personally. The search moved steadily closer to the recovery ward. Upstairs, Anna stood alone beside the medicine cabinet, staring at a stack of patient files. Every page represented a life. Every signature carried responsibility. Then her eyes settled on James's chart. The diagnosis listed his injuries, his treatment, and his steady improvement. It also identified him as an American military prisoner. She rested her hand on the folder without opening it. Her father's words returned once more, as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Medicine should never wear a uniform. Yet the world outside had never accepted that belief. Footsteps climbed the staircase. They were no longer distant. Anna drew one slow breath, removed James's chart from the stack, and looked toward the empty isolation room at the far end of the corridor. In that quiet moment, she understood that the next decision would not determine only the future of one recovering pilot. It would reveal whether her principles were real only when they were easy, or whether they could survive the moment they demanded a personal price. Anna carried the folder into the records office and closed the door behind her with deliberate care. The room was barely large enough for 2 filing cabinets, a narrow desk, and a single lamp that cast long shadows across stacks of aging documents. She placed James's chart beside a blank admission form and stood perfectly still. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the wind pressing against the windows. She knew every line on those pages could determine what happened next. Through the glass, she caught sight of the officers moving farther down the corridor, stopping briefly at each room before continuing their inspection. Time was disappearing one careful step at a time. Anna uncapped her fountain pen. Her handwriting remained steady even though her thoughts raced. She prepared a revised chart transferring James from the recovery ward to the hospital's isolated infectious care room, an area that had remained empty since the previous autumn. She added clear instructions restricting unnecessary entry because of a suspected contagious fever that required strict quarantine. The diagnosis would discourage casual inspection. It was not a perfect shield, but it might buy precious time. She returned the original chart to a locked drawer beneath the desk and placed the revised file on top of the active patient records. There was no triumph in what she had done, only quiet resolve. Moments later, the officers reached the recovery ward. The senior officer requested every chart without looking at the patients themselves. Dr. Vogel handed over the stack with measured composure while Anna remained beside the medicine cart, her hands folded calmly in front of her apron. The officer paused when he reached the revised file. His eyes lingered on the quarantine notice before lifting toward Anna. "This patient has been isolated?" he asked. "Yes," Anna answered without hesitation. "The symptoms developed unexpectedly. We have limited access until we understand the condition." Her voice never rose. She simply sounded like a nurse explaining routine procedure. The officer studied her expression, perhaps expecting uncertainty, but found only quiet professionalism. After a long moment, he closed the folder and stepped back. "No unnecessary exposure," he said to the others. "We continue." Their footsteps gradually faded toward the opposite wing of the hospital. Only after the corridor fell silent did Anna allow herself a slow breath. Inside the isolation room, James had heard enough to understand that something extraordinary had just happened. When Anna entered carrying fresh water and clean linens, he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You did not have to do that," he whispered. Anna adjusted the blanket across his shoulders before meeting his eyes. "No," she replied softly. "I chose to." James lowered his gaze, searching for words that never came. For the first time in many months, he realized that courage was not always found on a battlefield. Sometimes it appeared in the quiet confidence of a single person willing to protect a stranger without asking for recognition, reward, or even the promise that history would ever remember what had been done. 2 mornings later, the sound of distant artillery had disappeared. In its place came something no one inside the hospital had expected to welcome so quickly: silence. It settled across the courtyard like the fresh snow, interrupted only by the creaking branches of bare trees and the cautious voices of people stepping outside for the first time in days. Rumors traveled through the corridors before official news arrived. German units had withdrawn from the surrounding area. Allied forces were approaching the town. Nobody celebrated. Nobody mourned openly. Everyone simply looked tired, as though the weight of years had become too heavy to carry another mile. Dr. Vogel gathered the nurses for a brief meeting. "Our duty remains unchanged," he said quietly. "Today we treat whoever comes through those doors." Anna nodded without speaking. Those words sounded remarkably familiar. They echoed the lesson her father had lived by and the decision she had defended only days before. By late afternoon, military vehicles rolled slowly into the town square. Their engines rumbled through the cold air before falling silent outside the hospital gates. A different set of uniforms entered the building, this time accompanied by medical officers carrying lists of prisoners and displaced civilians. There were no raised voices, only careful questions, measured answers, and the slow work of restoring order after months of uncertainty. James stood beside the window when Anna entered the isolation room one final time. He was dressed in a borrowed wool coat that hung loosely across his shoulders, ready to leave under Allied supervision. The small German-language book rested neatly on the bedside table. He picked it up and held it carefully before offering it back to her. "I think this belongs here," he said with a faint smile. Anna accepted the worn book, running her fingers gently across its faded cover. "Keep the words," she replied. "The book can stay." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different now. It no longer belonged to fear or uncertainty. It belonged to understanding. James reached into his coat pocket and removed the small metal identification tag that had rested around his neck since the day he entered military service. He looked at it briefly before closing his hand again. "I spent a long time believing courage always looked the same," he said softly. "I was wrong." Anna met his eyes with the same calm expression she had worn since the first day they met. "You survived," she answered. "That is enough." James slowly shook his head. "No," he replied with quiet certainty. "You saved far more than my life." Anna lowered her gaze for only a second before giving the smallest smile he had ever seen. "I treated a patient," she said. "The rest is for history to decide." A nurse called from the hallway, letting James know that the transport convoy was ready. He gave one final nod before walking toward the open door, carrying with him no souvenir except a handful of German words and the memory of a woman who had quietly refused to let compassion surrender to war. 30 years passed before James Carter returned to the quiet German town that had lived in his memory far longer than any battlefield ever had. Time had softened the scars left by war. The damaged buildings had been rebuilt. Young trees lined streets that had once stood empty beneath falling snow. Children rode bicycles through the town square without knowing how close history had once come to changing their ordinary afternoon. James walked slowly, carrying no military medals, no official escort, and no expectation that anyone would remember his name. He had spent decades raising a family, building a peaceful life, and speaking only rarely about the winter that changed him forever. Yet one promise had remained unfinished. He wanted to thank the woman whose courage had quietly reshaped the course of his life. The old hospital still stood, although it had become a community medical center filled with bright windows and modern equipment. Inside the entrance hall, the familiar scent of clean linen and fresh coffee replaced the coal smoke he remembered. A young receptionist welcomed him with a warm smile. When he asked about Anna Keller, her expression became thoughtful. She searched through a directory before gently explaining that Anna had continued serving patients there for many years after the war. She never sought recognition, never spoke publicly about what she had done, and retired with little more than the respect of those who worked beside her. She had passed away quietly several years earlier. James thanked her and asked one final question. "Is there somewhere I can remember her?" The receptionist nodded and led him to a small memorial garden behind the building. It was peaceful, a stone pathway curved beneath tall oak trees where birds sang without interruption. Near a simple wooden bench stood a modest plaque surrounded by white flowers. There was no long biography, no list of honors, no mention of nations or uniforms. Only her name and one quiet sentence. She never asked who deserved to live. She only asked who needed her. James removed his hat and stood silently for a long time. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and placed his old military identification tag beneath the flowers. It was the only possession he had carried from that winter, and somehow it no longer belonged to him. Before leaving, he opened the small notebook he always kept while traveling and wrote a single sentence for his grandchildren to read someday. "The bravest person I ever met never carried a weapon. She carried hope into a room where fear had already arrived." He closed the notebook, looked once more toward the quiet garden, and walked away with lighter steps than when he had arrived. History would remember generals, victories, and treaties, but the world continued because ordinary people chose kindness when no one expected it. Anna never raised her voice. She raised the standard by which humanity would always be measured.